So, when looking at the United States versus Europe in terms of their economic systems, I think there's a lot of factors to take into consideration. First off, I'm going to keep Canada, Australia, and New Zealand out of this analysis because I guess Canada, as usual, is somewhere in between the US and Europe. And I would assume Australia and New Zealand are probably the same. So, yeah, I mean, for the purpose of simplicity, I'm just going to compare the US with Europe. And when talking about Europe, I'm going to be looking at the more economically prosperous European countries. So basically, Northwestern Europe. So that would be like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, UK, Ireland, and arguably France. Like France is kind of, as I've said many times, is Schrodinger's northern slash southern European country. So it kind of clusters with both in different ways. So it's a bit in between in that regard. But yeah, I mean, some of the things I'm saying could apply to southern and eastern Europe also. But because those regions are a bit less prosperous, I'm going to be in this comparison when I'm talking about Europe, I'm really talking about northwestern Europe. So, when looking at the economic systems of the US versus Europe, which comes out on top? Well, I think it really depends on what you're looking for in life. If you're somebody who is extremely ambitious, extremely workaholic, and you just want to make a shit ton of money, then the US is probably the place to do it because there's lower taxes, higher GDP per capita, higher median income, more opportunities to make a shit ton of money. But there are actually downsides to the American system. Even though, yes, if you just want to make a shit ton of money, it's probably the best place to do it. But the downsides to the American system are that if you're not a workaholic and you don't want to slave away, if what you really want to do is just put in a decent job, not put in 110%, just 100%, if you're the person who doesn't want to go the extra mile, who's like, you know what, I value my break time, my lunch break, I value my vacation time, I value not being bothered by my employer when I'm at home or when it's not work hours. If that's what you value, then the European system actually makes a lot more sense because many European countries actually have laws that restrict employers from behaving that way and that enshrine your free time by law. And it's not only the law, it's also just the general culture that exists toward work in Europe. So that's the big thing to take into consideration is what style of work culture do you prefer? And some people do prefer the American style. I'm not one of them. Personally, I prefer the European style. Canada's style is somewhere in between, and because it's somewhere in between, and because I have, family and friends here, I'm not motivated enough to get off my ass and move to Europe. But nonetheless, I mean, I've considered it. I've considered that I would be happier there. But all things considered, the Canadian system, I think Europe is better, but because Canada's in between and we're not full America in that regard, I guess it's tolerable enough for me to get by on a day-to-day level. Plus, I'm not poor in terms of my background, so there is that. Speaking of which, yeah, there's also the question of where it is better or worse to be poor. Because even though the United States has a higher GDP per capita and a higher median income, especially after tax, you have to take into consideration the fact that the US also has a significantly higher portion of people who would basically be considered destitute in terms of how poor they are, like people who are just dirt poor. And it's not just the blacks, the Hispanics, and the natives. I haven't seen these statistics subdivided by race, but judging from what I've seen personally with my own eyes, I would guess that the US and also Canada have a higher percentage of dirt poor people as a percentage of the white population compared to any given European country, at least Northwestern European countries. Because I see a lot more homeless in North America compared to Europe. I would even say I see more homeless people in North America compared to Southern and Eastern Europe. Um, to be honest, I'm not sure where in Europe I saw the most homeless people. I would say probably Paris, followed by Naples. But even then, I feel like, and maybe London also, but even then, I feel like North American cities have more. And I'm not just talking about the major cities. In fact, sometimes the smaller cities have more homeless people than the bigger cities. That's something that I'm finding to be increasingly true lately. Like, the only place where you don't have a ton of homeless everywhere these days in North America is basically either like straight up rural areas like the absolute boonies or upper middle class wealthy suburbs. Everywhere else, I guess you don't really have too many in the lower middle class suburbs either. Although I see them a little bit there, but not that much. But yeah, where you see a ton of homeless is the downtown areas, and also like the downtown areas of both big cities and smaller cities. And increasingly, you see them in small towns also. And usually they're in the downtown area of the small town too, like kind of like the Main Street area. But yeah, it's becoming an endemic problem here. Um, so yeah, there's homelessness. There's also in terms of crime rates, like as I've said many times, it is hard to find statistics on any crime other than murder for European countries. I've not been able to find reliable statistics on any crime other than murder for European countries. And the problem is murder rates do correlate with overall crime rates, but it's not a perfect correlation. For instance, New Orleans has sky high murder rates, but the rates for other crimes are maybe a bit worse than average for an American city, but nowhere near as disproportionately high as their murder rate. Conversely, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, their murder rates are fairly average for an American city, maybe below average, actually. In the case of, I think, Seattle and Portland, I think probably have at least a bit below average murder rates for a large American city. But their rates of other crimes, like property crime, are sky high. Like auto theft, burglary, stuff like that, like theft. Like there's a difference between theft, robbery, and burglary, but I think all those are pretty high in Seattle and Portland. So yeah, and same with Vancouver. Vancouver has a very low murder rate, consistent with most Canadian cities. Well, I wouldn't say very low, but it's pretty low. It's like 2 per 100,000, which is by North American standards quite low. But it has very high rates of auto theft and other types of theft and burglary. So yeah, I mean, murder rates do not perfectly correlate with other types of crimes. So I cannot say with any confidence what the crime rate for anything other than murder is in Europe. However, the murder rates are way, way lower in Europe than the United States. It's not even in the same ballpark. Like, and lower than in Canada too. Canada again is in between. We're closer to Europe in that regard. Although Winnipeg is closer to the United States. But yeah, if I was to guess, I would guess that with other crimes like robbery, assault, burglary, I would guess the US probably has a higher crime rate than most European countries overall, although it can vary from country to country. But I will say in the US, there are much worse problems with like entire swaths of cities being like semi-abandoned ghettos that are just like basically no-go zones. And in the US, in Europe, the worst areas are often like shitty apartment buildings that are kind of off to the side, whereas in the US, the worst areas often are in the center cities. So that can be a problem because the center city, you often need to go there for various reasons, be it for work, for entertainment, like to go to restaurants, or to, if you're using public transit, like to use the train station. Like there's, like frankly, if you're going to have an area be a shithole, it's not good to have the center city be the area that's a shithole. It's much better to have it be some area that's off to the side, as is the case in many European cities. So, yeah, I mean, that's a problem in the United States right there. But I would say overall, the trade-off between the European and the American economic system is that with the American economic system, you can make more money, but the quality of the society around you is worse because there's more crime, there's more urban decay. Uh, the amenities aren't as good in many ways, and like the public transit sucks, and in many ways it's just there's not as much of a sense of like there's not as many good places you can go that give you a sense of like actual community, if that's what you're looking for, like places with historic architecture, places with a lot of like independent restaurants, walkable neighborhoods, things like that. So if that's what you're looking for, like the United States does have those places, but Europe has them a lot more per capita. And I would say it is a result of the economic system to some extent, because the American economic system, it's more capitalistic and it's more individualistic. So it favors kind of the hoarding and accumulation of wealth by individuals and by families rather than giving that wealth back into the community. And I do think, higher taxes do have certain benefits. Like you get better public transit, better institutions, like that you get subsidized healthcare, subsidized education. Well, the U.S. has subsidized education, at least for up to high school, but not for college or university. But yeah, better quality public education in Europe. And yeah, they get subsidized higher education too. So there's like healthcare, education, various social benefits, in case you're undergoing hard times. I mean, I'm sure plenty of people who aren't total parasites have had to use the welfare system. So, I mean, there's all that. And yeah, like better public transit, like a lot of there are a lot of benefits to living in a society where you pay more taxes and where there's more of a safety net. But that being said, again, it does depend to some extent on your individual preferences. So that being said, okay, even if your preferences are more in line with the European model, I mean, I do hear some critics of the European model say, yeah, well, it's not going to last. It's all going to fall apart. I don't know, because maybe it will, but it's not happening yet. Frankly, America looks like it's closer to falling apart than Europe is in terms of just social unrest. I mean, yes, there's been riots and stuff in Europe, but America seems to have more chronic issues with homelessness and crime. And it just seems to be a growing problem. Like you just see the homeless like everywhere these days, like everywhere that's not a super exclusive upper middle class suburb or the literal middle of nowhere in the boonies. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about that argument that the European system's just about to fall apart any day now, because people have been saying that for decades and it still hasn't happened. So there's that, but I think the bigger argument, if there's one argument to be made in favor of the American system, which I do think is a legitimate argument to take a look at. I mean, as somebody like me who favors the European system, I do have to acknowledge this and be critical of my own perspectives, which is the argument that Europe in some ways parasites off America and leeches off American productivity and American innovation. Now, people also use this argument for the military. I think that's bullshit, because I don't think anybody in Europe asked America to station all these troops there, and many Europeans don't want these troops there. They don't want to get involved in all these Middle Eastern wars, which are the main reason why Europe gets threatened militarily by various Islamic extremist groups. Like, a lot of Europeans just don't want any involvement in this shit, and I do think that's America's fault. That's not Europe's, and Europe doesn't necessarily need bigger armies. Like, what's much smarter is to like be in a situation where you don't have to fight a war. Like, I'm pretty sure there's some passage in The Art of War that says that, or something similar. Yeah, there is actually. But yeah, I mean, maybe they could put a little bit more money into their own militaries, but I don't think any European is asking, hardly any Europeans are asking for this. So I think that argument is bullshit. Like, oh, we subsidize your defense. I think it's like literally the mafia saying, oh, you pay us for protection. It's like, protection from who? From you. Like, give me a break. Protection from the people who you piss off. So yeah, I mean, that argument I think is bullshit, but I think there's more validity, at least possibly, to the argument that Europe and the rest of the world can to some extent leech off America in terms of productivity and innovation. The idea that like America is the economic engine that keeps the world going and that produces more technological and scientific innovation than anywhere else. Now, I can't vouch for how true those claims are, but I do know, yes, a lot of technology, a lot of advancement in, science, medical technology, various types of tech, like a lot of that does come from the US, it's true. Some comes from East Asia, some comes from Europe also. Some comes from Israel a little bit. But yeah, I mean, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand a little bit too. But I mean, yes, the US probably is responsible for, even on a per capita level, a disproportionate amount of innovation and, I guess, economic growth that does kind of stimulate, Europe and the world as a whole. That is true. However, what are the counter arguments to that? Well, one counter argument is the idea that it's actually kind of unfair to Americans. And if Americans wanted a more European style system, it's a bit unfair to them that they are the ones who must suffer so that the entire world must be more prosperous. So if anything, it's a bit like the short story of the ones who walk away from Omelas or the lottery, where you have like one person or a few people suffering so that the vast majority can be more prosperous, or sort of like in Minority Report with the precogs, 3 people suffering so the rest of us can have a society without murder. It's a bit like that. It's like, does the average American deserve to suffer with an economic system that potentially fucks them over, just so Americans and the rest of the world can have more faster scientific innovation and maybe a bit more economic productivity that stimulates the entire world? Is that fair? Like, ironically, is it Americans who suffer the most from this? And I think that's a valid question that we need to ask. And again, that wouldn't be an argument in favor of the American system, but it would be an argument in favor of the idea that, like, yes, the rest of us do parasite off the Americans in some ways. And yeah, maybe we do have to accept, like, some economic downturn and some slowing down of technological progress so that Americans can have that vacation time, so that they can have a bit more welfare, even if it hurts their economic productivity a little bit. Because is that fair to them? Also, I do question, is more technological progress a good thing in all areas? Because like with AI or VR, we could be creating man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. And we may have reached the point where technological progress has become more of a liability than an advantage, and where maybe we've progressed enough and we can slow that shit down. So it's like, hey, thank you for your service, America, but yeah, maybe we should just slow things down a bit right now. Maybe it would be better for you guys and for the rest of us. Now there's the question, is America the driver of technological growth in every area? I don't know, because America doesn't seem to be a leader in clean energy, for instance. Like, they're not employing that much on a domestic level. They're sure as hell not a leader in train technology, at least insofar as it's been employed in their own country, like public transit. The question is America developing technologies that other countries are employing more than America does? I don't have the answer to that. I don't know. It's an interesting question, though. But yeah, we have to look at not only technological growth, but the technological growth that actually benefits humanity. Like, I would say better public transit, more clean energy benefits humanity in terms of technological progress more than almost anything else. It benefits us more than AI, more than VR, and more than, like, better fucking graphics in video games. Like, I mean, I like having better graphics in video games, but we have to look at what really benefits humanity. And is America the nation producing that stuff? I mean, I've heard, yes, America does produce a lot of medical technology, a lot of breakthroughs in that regard. But I don't know. I mean, they're not the ones implementing green tech the most, that's for sure, in public transit. So I don't know if they're the ones producing it. So I don't know. Maybe the best thing is that Atlas should shrug. I mean, okay, why am I using a libertarian metaphor? But it's kind of accurate. Like maybe the Americans, kind of like the precogs at the end of Minority Report, should be like, no, we're not going to be the world's sacrificial lamb anymore. We're not going to submit ourselves to no vacation time, no workers' rights, hardly any social services compared to other countries. We're gonna improve our own services, our own infrastructure, and we're gonna do it even if it means slowing the pace of our technological progress and scientific progress, even if that might negatively impact us and the rest of the world to some extent. No, I would support the Americans. I'd get behind them if that was their attitude. Like, we're not going to be your lab rats anymore. We're not going to be your workaholic, hustle culture fucking tech geeks anymore. We're not going to be these people anymore who are sweating like working until we die by the sweat of our brow so we can be the economic engine of the entire world. We're gonna implement more workers' rights. We're not gonna be lazy pieces of shit, but we're gonna implement more workers' rights, and we're gonna implement more social services. We're gonna use money more to improve the commons for the public good rather than just to stimulate the economy. I'd be okay with that, And if it means some economic stagnation, not just in America, but globally, and some technological stagnation, not just in America, but globally, then fine. Frankly, rather than new technology is important, but there's a lot of technology we already have that we could be implementing a lot better. And that's a big thing. I think sometimes people put too much emphasis on innovation and not enough on implementing the tech that we already have. Particularly when it comes to anything to do with the environment and green technology. Like Bill Gates, he obsesses over all this pie in the sky stuff, but then he neglects the technology we already have. And the same is true with people like Elon Musk. All these fucking playboy, philanthropist, genius, whatever the fuck Tony Stark calls himself. Yeah. Those types. It is true. That is a problem with that whole hustle culture mentality. It's always always focusing on the shiny new thing and never focusing on how we can implement the technology we already have. And that's a big thing. And I don't know, are some European countries maybe a little bit too socialist for their own good? It's possible. It's possible maybe some of them could dial it back a tiny bit. But I think overall, Europe has the best economic system for creating a superior quality of life. And I mean, yeah, maybe if Atlas shrugs, if America decides to go that way. I know that's not really the metaphor. It's sort of the metaphor in Atlas Shrugged, but to prove an opposite, because in Atlas Shrugged, it's the rich people stop working, but the point is to prove how lazy everyone else is. But in this case, it would be the Americans, rich and poor, stop busting their balls as much as they're currently doing. But the point isn't to prove that everyone else is lazy. The point is to prove that they deserve some workers' rights, some free time, some social services also. So again, yes, if Atlas shrugs, will there be negative economic consequences across the world and in America? Probably. But will it be a better quality of life overall for Americans? I would say yes. And I would say, frankly, they've earned it. So go ahead, Atlas. Shrug as much as you want. Throw that fucking big ass flat earth off your shoulders. So yeah, that's my feelings on the American versus European economic systems.